Hello, Ashley.
Hello.
We are ready for our final January fan favorite episode, and this is a great one.
This is a really good one. This is one that really stayed with me. And another friend of mine, Jill, that listened to it, we look at each other when we're in crowded areas and we're like, okay, where's the exits? How can I get out? It sticks with you.
Yes, so tragic. It touched my heart when we were doing the research on this tragedy. It disturbed me. It touched me, and I agree with you. It stayed with me as well. We're talking about the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire.
Yes.
And it was requested actually by two people.
Yes, two of our listeners. One was Hayden, and he said, you guys went pretty extensive on this one, but I loved the Beverly Hills Supper Club episode. It was very sad, but it was very interesting and one of my favorite episodes. And listener Lizzie said, I choose the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. It was one of my favorites. My dad used to talk about it, and it's crazy how things happen in your own backyard and you know nothing about it, even in the age of Google with information at your fingertips.
Yeah. This is an episode that has resonated with a lot of other people as well. On YouTube, I looked this up just to remind myself. We had one comment right after we posted this episode originally where a person said, "Thank you for covering the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. So many people were killed, 165. And that was someone whose handle was at Southgate, Kentucky, Southgate 3022. And then another person commented, "My husband was a 17-year-old fireman on the hill that night.
Wow.
I babysat for my neighbors that had family there, and I graduated from high school the week before the fire with classmate Walter Bailey."
Oh, Walter.
Yes, this is one that is so meaningful to people. And so I'm glad that we're going to be revisiting it.
Yes.
And you had a follow-up to share, didn't you?
I did. We talked about at the end, I believe it's at the end of the episode, where you talked about a book that had been written. And the book was called Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld and the Supper Club Inferno by Peter Bronson. It now has 401 reviews on Amazon. It has 4.5 stars. And on Goodreads, it has 143 reviews with a total of 3.9 stars, which I assume it's out of 4 on Goodreads. But I'm going to read to you this person's review on Amazon, and he gives it 5 stars. It's a verified purchase from Stephen R. Kramer. Kramer. And it was written in 2022, the review was. As a regional police and sometimes crime historian, I was certainly aware of the Campbell, Kenton, and Butler counties post-Remus criminal element and low and infamous visitors and or residents, but I had no idea just how violent the Remus remnant had become, nor that it extended into the 70s when my wife and I became engaged in the Supper Club and when friends of our family were later killed. I am a retired police lieutenant and president of the Greater Cincinnati Police Historical Society and the museum's historian, and found every fact to coincide with what we know and a whole lot more. Mr. Bronson was also one of 2 reporters I trusted in my 38 and a half years of policing. He is the genuine article.
That's a glowing review.
Yes, it really is. And I have a little notebook of where I write my thoughts after I read the books. And I'll just read you what I wrote. I read this book in September of 2023, so it would have been right after our episode.
Yes.
And I wrote my opinion, which was, well, Peter has completely convinced me that the horrifying Supper Club fire was arson. He begins at the beginning in the 20s and lays out a pattern of wickedness and lawlessness. My only hesitation was answered when he said the timing mechanism was off. It was set for PM instead of AM. Mobsters don't kill en masse like that, but these idiots did. I felt overwhelmed with profound sadness thinking of all the lives senselessly lost. What a horrifying way to die, and what a horrifying way to live. To be a gangster is just Russian roulette with the devil. Your time will come, and the house always wins. I was fascinated to read the connection to the Kennedy assassination as well. Peter's completely sold me. It is well researched and impartial for the most part. The only docking I give it, because I knocked off a star, is the lack of paragraphs because it made it bulky to read, but I loved all the supporting photographs.
Wow. So just for our listeners who've not heard the episode before,
Yeah.
it really focuses in on the tragedy
Yes,
of the Beverly Hills
absolutely,
Supper Club
yes.
fire. And oh my goodness, the story, it will disturb you, but it will fascinate you.
Yes.
And we go through that in great detail. Your references to the book is
Correct.
actually talking about, towards the end, we mentioned that there are many people who believe it
That it
was
was not a-
arson, that
yes,
it was
that it
not
was-
an accidental
yes.
thing. Yes. And so when you finish the episode, if you're interested, you you will hear that book mentioned.
Yes.
And obviously, Ashley is a fan.
I am. I mean, I lean into conspiracy anyway, but I didn't feel like this was a conspiracy by the time I finished the book. You can kind of feel sensational, like, ooh, it's going to be, but he was so thorough and he presented the facts to me and to all these other folks. Like this made sense. It wasn't just something that it seemed like it could be. It seemed like it was. But of course, if you choose to read it, please do form your own opinion. And there are a lot of people who don't believe it. And that is also valid. I am someone who did not go through this, had no one that I know to my knowledge that was in this. As an outsider, listening to what you related and then reading this book, that's a conclusion I drew. But other people may feel completely different, and that's okay too.
And you know what? It would be interesting after you listen to this rewind of the Beverly Hills Supper Club Fire episode. You might want to weigh in.
Yeah.
You put one of the comments on our social media post, or let us know what your thoughts are, especially if you are someone from the area who maybe has more background and more information at your fingertips than some others. So we've kind of put an intriguing intro out there.
Yes, we have.
So let's go ahead and play the episode.
Let's do it. This episode of Scandal Water contains adult themes and descriptions of violence. It is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
and Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1. Stories in Scandal Water. It's where you need to be. Stories in Scandal Water. Let's pour you a cup of tea.
Hello, Ashley.
Hello, Candy.
This theme is just fascinating. This idea of in our own backyards, and of course what we are zooming in on are kind of tragic things that happened in our own backyards. And this one is one that I think I have found even more fascinating because I was totally unaware of this.
As was I. Yes,
and the suggestion actually came from Brian.
Yes, I told him that you were looking for things that kind of events that were a little bit tied to entertainment that had happened in Kentucky for our September theme, and the very first thing he said was this topic. And I looked it up. I looked up the pictures and I sent it to you, and you said we have to cover this.
Absolutely. This is one of those things where it's far enough in the past that it wasn't on my radar at all, yet it's recent enough, 1977, that there is so much archival information, so many photos, so many video clips, so many people today who still remember and talk about this, that as I was researching, I just became so invested in this. Oh, my heart goes out to everyone involved in this. Guys, the topic is the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire, the tragedy that occurred in 1977. If you are like us and you also knew nothing about this, I'm going to play just a few seconds from this video. It's a more recent clip where they have a reporter named Nick Clooney. He's reflecting back, but what I want you to hear is a few seconds they play from the 1977 news coverage.
Okay.
All right. So this will just be a few seconds.
Our major story this evening, the story of death and Holocaust at Beverly Hills Supper Club south of Newport in northern Kentucky.
I talked to said the place is fully engulfed. The firemen say there's just no question about it. There is no way to control it at this time. It's just all over the building. Having been inside,
the sky just went black. It was just this huge plume of smoke.
Well, I remember one of the firemen turned to me and he said they're piled up like cordwood in there.
how many people are still in the building, we do not know.
We'll stop there.
Ooh, I got goosebumps.
But that's the type of thing that was happening with this incident. It is absolutely heartbreaking. But we will talk about at the end that some good did come out of it.
Yes.
But let's go ahead and jump on in. We've already said neither one of us had any awareness of this at all.
And going into this episode, all the awareness I have had is I looked through archival photos before I sent it to you, and I kind of read a synopsis of it, but I have left the deep dive to you, so I'll be learning along with our listeners.
Okay, well, I guarantee you're going to find it as fascinating as I did. So going back to the beginning, it's funny. This is another one of those instances where there were lots of conflicting information, even about the date that the original Supper Club opened, but most of them seem to agree it was 1937. And when it first opened, it was, even back then, a very, very popular nightclub that also included a little illegal gambling. It had a back room where some of these illegal activities were going on. Lots of different sources said that the mob might have been involved with this.
Seems like it's up their alley.
Yes, over the years. In fact, that seemed to be a definite thing. Located in Southgate, Kentucky, just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, it was known for offering some of the best entertainment between New York and Chicago. And some of the personalities that performed on the stage over the years were people like Jimmy Durante, Milton Berle, Carol Channing, Lena Horne, Liberace, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sid Caesar. I mean, all these
are icons.
Yes, absolutely. Well, in the early 1960s, there was a crackdown. They were trying to clean up all these illegal activities, including mob-run clubs, which of course meant the Beverly Hills was part of that. And so when they tried to kind of clean it up, it actually caused the club to shut down. So in the mid-1960s, it closed and fell into disrepair. And then a man named Richard Schilling purchased the property, and he decided in 1970 to refurbish the whole thing, spending, now think about how much this was at that time, more than $3 million in renovations, and was going to turn this into this absolute stunning showpiece. I mean, just huge. I think they said 54,000 square feet, just a beautiful, opulent building. Now, an interesting little side note is during that renovation process back in 1970, there was actually a fire then too that set them back.
Oh.
But then
they rebuilt.
They refurbished again. I don't know if it took the whole building out, but there was a fire. I did not see this across multiple sources. There were some rumors or some talk of possible arson back then, but that was not something I saw across news sources. It was only one or two places where people were speculating.
Okay.
Now, that means that the Supper Club, as we are going to be talking about it, reopened in 1971 as a dinner theater. It did not have a casino this time, but it again became very, very popular, not only for its entertainment, but also as an event space where people would rent rooms and they would have weddings or wedding receptions or anniversary celebrations, proms, that type of thing. So this was huge and it was luxurious. It earned the nickname the Showplace of the Midwest.
That's a big deal.
And here it is. It's right there near people. Like it was in a great location, a great spot. And some people said that it was basically affordable. You could afford to have your wedding there. And just to give you an idea of how beautiful it was, it had a hall of mirrors, walls lined with oil paintings. Ooh. The ceilings had crystal chandeliers dangling from them. You had red carpeted floors. There was a grand staircase. I saw at one point, I think they had like a little indoor waterfall.
It's opulent.
Opulent is the word, exactly. And they had all these different rooms. I believe I saw somewhere it was something like 18, and they gave them different names based on their themes. Oh. So you had a zebra room and a Viennese room and a garden room. The cabaret room was the room.
The performance room?
Yes.
Okay.
Where you normally had a lot of your entertainment.
Okay.
The entertainment, though, we said we've got the event spaces, but the entertainment was a huge draw. One of the busboys at the time of the fire was quoted as saying, later when he was reflecting, he said it was considered the showplace of the nation on the East Coast. All the main entertainers from Vegas would come there to perform.
Interesting that he says the East Coast when we're not really near the East Coast.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know.
I'd say the Midwest. Like we're in the Midwest.
Yeah. So many different interviews came across my radar. Honestly, we could talk for like a week, I think. There was so much information, but I had to pick and choose. I thought this was interesting. I think everybody's heard in this area of Jeff Ruby because of the Jeff Ruby Steakhouse.
Yes.
He was present present the night of the fire.
Oh, he was.
He was there with friends the evening of the fire. So a lot of segments would feature him offering some of his memories. One of the interviews I saw was something he did for the Lexington News in 2021 on the advent of the 44th anniversary of the tragedy. And his description of the Supper Club was this, quote, "There was no place like it where you could see Vegas acts in such glamour and glitz. Private parties, weddings. I remember seeing Red Fox in the lounge."
Wow.
That's kind of the context of this place. On May 28th, 1977, which was the start of the Memorial Day weekend, the entertainment was a man that I don't think a lot of us maybe are very familiar with nowadays, but he was huge at the time.
Huge.
Megastar.
Yeah.
It was singer and actor John Davidson. Now, are you familiar with him?
I didn't know him by name, but when I saw his face, I was like, oh, I know this guy. And he was the host of Hollywood Squares.
Yes.
And I watched him on Hollywood Squares forever.
Yeah.
So that's what I knew him from. I did not know that he was a singer.
Well, apparently he was very versatile. When I started researching him a little bit, okay, he was kind of like a little bit like a Pat Boone. He was known for his clean image and his great voice and his great hair, but
He did have great hair.
He really did. But he starred in movies. He sang on Broadway. He headlined in Vegas. He subbed for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show more than 85, I think it was 87 times.
Oh, wow.
And he had his own talk show at one point. As you've said, he hosted some game shows. They said at his peak through the 1970s and into the 1980s, he earned $75,000 a week performing in Vegas, which would be nearly $500,000 in our money today.
A week?
Yeah.
So he's pretty big.
He was a megastar at that time. And he was like all over the news because at one point he had a date with Karen Carpenter. He sang with Mama Cass. He hung out with Kenny Rogers. This dude was huge. And I think a lot of people from the early 80s may remember him being the host, one of the hosts of a show called That's Incredible.
No, I don't know that show.
Okay. This particular night, he's a draw. They were selling tickets for $10, which
I can afford that.
it was more in 1977.
Well, yeah, that's
but
true.
you could still do it.
Yeah.
You could still do it, and the audience was packed.
I bet. Thinking about how big he was at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a common theme across all the sources. They oversold. Like when they had great entertainment, they oversold.
They packed the house,
They
literally.
absolutely did. Bring in some extra chairs, put in some extra tables, get as many people in this room as you can because this is a hot item. So most of the sources said there were approximately 3,000 people in the building. Now, not necessarily all for this entertainment because remember,
There's other rooms
there
and
are
other things
rooms,
going
other
on.
things going on, exactly. But according to an article in the Dayton Daily News, the cabaret room alone, which is the room where the entertainment was happening, contained 1,200 people, which was at least 300 more than its designated capacity.
Oh, no.
Some sources said it was
Double.
It was, yeah, that the capacity was even lower.
Oh.
So definitely overcrowded. That theme came up so much, I pulled a quote from a woman named Cindy Triber. She was not there the night of the fire, but she had attended an event 6 months before the fire, and she was quoted in a 1997 newspaper article, just to kind of give context, as saying, quote, "It was so crowded that a waitress could not walk her way into our group to serve drinks. For the first time in my life, I was scared. I looked at Bob, who was her husband, and asked him how we would get out of there if something happened."
Ooh, she had like a feeling.
Yeah, but that's the kind of sardine-like atmosphere that the people were in who had come to see John Davidson. As we've said, this building was used for other things. On this particular night, there was actually a wedding reception that was taking place in the Zebra Room that ended around 8:30 p.m. And it was reported that some of the people attending that reception actually complained that the room was warm and smoky when they left. One source said that there was even some comments about it being uncomfortably warm to the point that the butter was melting on their tables.
Oh, no. But maybe they thought it was all the body heat.
Well, I mean, they complained to the staff. Like, they felt like this was something unusual. This was
Yeah.
something that needed to be reported. Now, again, I had to piece together details, which were sometimes conflicting. So I'm going with the version of events that I saw most often. Okay. So the basic story of how this happened seemed to be that around 8:45 p.m., a female employee, some sources said waitress, some just said staff member, noticed smoke and opened the Zebra Room's door, kind of looking for the cause of the smoke, which we're going to later...
And the zebra room is where the wedding party was? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes. Now, from all accounts that we'll come back to later, this all seemed to be emanating from the ceiling. We're going to come back to it seemed to be this small fire that was smoldering in the ceiling. Okay. Now, again, conflicting reports. Some sources said that the employees didn't see flames, but knew there was trouble because they started seeing smoke. Now, the smoke is a definite. There was definitely smoke and feeling like heat, like it was getting really hot near the ceiling. But there were some other sources that straight up said employees saw flames at some point. In fact, I pulled a quote from a 1977 Washington Post article that said, quote, several waitresses in one dining area tried unsuccessfully to put the fire out with portable extinguishers.
Interesting.
Regardless, it is a known fact that one of the staff members, we think it's this woman, told somebody to call the fire department. The fire department received a call at 9:01 p.m. and they were on the scene within 3 to 4 minutes, at which time the firefighters sent several trucks. The first ones in line could already see smoke coming from the building at this point by the time they got there, which was around 9:05.
Wow.
But an immediate problem for them was the way that this club, it was so huge,
The parking.
right? Yes.
Getting through all those cars.
It sat on this isolated spot. It was a 17-acre site. And so the club itself was kind of atop this hill. And so you had to kind of wind up this road to get to it. And then you had your parking lots, of course. It was so jam-packed. They had cars all over the parking lot, but they also had all these cars lining the road leading up to the club. And by the time they're getting there, people are spilling out of the club. You've got people milling around who are like evacuating the building.
Evacuating or just leaving?
At this point, there are some people evacuating the building. Okay. We're going to kind of go back in the timeline a few seconds to what was happening inside.
Okay.
But so they are already basically hitting a traffic jam in some cases. And it was reported by somebody in the Carolina Fire Rescue EMS Journal that the location of the fire trucks where they had to stop relative to the building made for, quote, extremely long hose lays for water supply. So it made it hard to get the hoses and the water to the building. Okay, but let's go back into the building. Remember, the employees saw trouble.
Yep, they've called the fire department.
By 9:01, they're already concerned enough that they have called for help. And what happened next is they didn't realize it at the time, but the act of opening that door had actually, it had actually allowed oxygen into the space, which had caused the fire that they think was smoldering up in the ceiling to ignite. And so it did not take, and the smoke was a huge prevalent thing. So the employees who were kind of in this area and part of this conversation, they had figured out this is a serious problem. We need to be doing something. Now, at this point in the evening, John Davison has not yet started to perform.
Okay.
Who's on stage is his opening act. It's this two-man team. I think they had a ventriloquist dummy, several probably. So it was a short little comedy show that was like the warm-up. And they're the ones who were on stage. The same Dayton Daily News article I referenced just a bit ago. This is so cool. He actually came up in so many different sources and he gave interviews later. But there was an 18-year-old busboy named Walter Bailey. And he tried to say to one of the supervisors, we've got to do something. Like this is like, they could see things were escalating quickly. He was like, we've got to tell people, we've got to do something. And the supervisor was kind of like, like he was indecisive. This 18-year-old boy walked onto the stage, interrupted the comedy team. It was these two gentlemen, Jim Teeter and Jim McDonald, the opening act. And he basically got the mic from them and he delivers a little statement, an announcement to everybody seated in the room. Here's how he told it later. These are Walter's words. I climbed on stage. I appear in front of the comedians and they look at me and I went toward the one on the left reaching for his mic. And to my surprise, he handed it to me. And I turned toward the audience and said, I'd like everyone's attention. If you look to your right, you'll see an exit. If you look behind you, you'll see another exit. And in the left corner, you'll see another one. We need everyone to leave the building. There's a fire in the building.
Oh, goodness. It gives me chills, too. How calm he was, how he pointed out the exits, like find the exit closest to you. Oh, man, I hope he went into like service positions later, like policemen.
He didn't. He actually ended up going to college, and I saw that he had like, I think, a business degree, and he did something in business and was very successful. But so many people gave him the same kudos that you did. They said this 18-year-old boy, this teenager, performed probably the biggest life-saving act of this evening.
Yes.
And they talked about his calm and how he prevented panic, and just
He didn't get up there and scream, "The building's on fire, you have to run, get out." He
Yes.
just said, "Look behind you, look to your right, look to your left. We need to leave the building."
Yeah, unbelievable. And he's thinking he's going to get fired because at this point he doesn't know, are they going to be able to put this out easily? But he just felt like he had to do this. Here's the terrible part. A lot of people didn't take him seriously.
They thought it was part of the act?
Exactly.
Oh, no.
A woman named Norma Lou Mitchell, who was there that night, said later he seemed like he was part of the act, and that was a theme. So many of them said. Now, some people did. So what happened was there's so many people in this room. There were some people who were like, kind of like, oh, okay. And they had been smelling smoke. Several people reported they'd actually been smelling smoke for a while, but it was kind of like, oh, it must be no big deal. Either,
or something in the kitchen?
Yeah, something's in the kitchen, or it's been this way for a while, no big deal. But some people start to filter out. Nobody seems to feel urgency. And a lot of the people don't move because they either didn't pay attention or they think it's all a joke. At least the news has been conveyed,
Yeah,
though.
yeah.
Okay? Jeff Ruby was one of the ones who did listen. He's one of the ones who gave credit to Walter later for doing such a wonderful thing. And I believe Jeff Ruby, that was his cue to kind of head out the building. While many did not immediately take Walter's warning to heart or really understand what was going on, there was an awareness now, and other red flags just start piling up fast. And
Very, very quickly.
Yes. That's something that, there were so many things about this that struck me. This is just the most tragic story. But I was taken aback time and time again at how fast everything escalated. Like, if you did not make split-second decisions in this event,
It was life or death.
that was it for some people. What did happen was staff members are aware, not everybody, because think about how many staff, but those who were in the vicinity, who are aware of what's happening, who are picking up on it, they start trying to get people out and spread the word in other ways. So for example, there's a man named John Hoyle. He was the chief executive officer from the St. Luke Hospital. He was actually at the Supper Club that night with his wife and some members of his medical staff. And he was in the cabaret room the night, there to see John Davidson. And he remembers a busboy telling him, quote, "There is a fire. You have to leave. Go across the hall. Go across the Empire Room." And he listened to that busboy and he did leave. Now, he had to go through this route because something was blocked and he had to go a different way. But John Hoyle ultimately escaped and immediately had to join the medical workers who were treating the people who were caught in the fire, injured in the fire.
So he's escaping from a fire that he can't see. He goes outside and he starts treating people who are in the fire.
Yeah, he ends up becoming one of the medical workers who would work for just hours
all
upon
night.
hours. Yeah, absolutely. Another busboy shared that when he saw all the heavy smoke and realized how serious the situation was, he literally just started running to different places in this massive sprawling building. For example, he remembered specifically going to the bar area, and he would just yell at people, "You have to get out. There's a fire." But again, this place is huge, and people were in all the nooks and crannies. Think about 3,000 people.
And there was no fire alarm back then, I'm assuming.
No fire alarm, no sprinklers. Some survivors, as I've said, remembered they smelled smoke for a while, but it suddenly escalated. When that fire ignited,
Which we think happened when they opened the door to the
that
Zebra room.
definitely was something that caused it to take off.
Okay.
And then it just went crazy because they said that it started shooting down the hallways. And then, of course, it would catch on things. We'll talk about that in just a second. But black smoke started to pour into the cabaret room. Some people would later describe it using words like heavy, hot, sickening, and sour. One person later described it as smelling like 100 tires burst into flames. Now,
Oh, yeah, I can picture that kind of smell then. Sickening. Yeah, that's a good way to describe that. Tires burning would be a horrible smell.
yeah, and the thickness of it, how it affects your visibility.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing.
I think a lot of people die from smoke inhalation before they die from the flames. Is that right?
Absolutely.
I don't mean in this case. I mean in general with the fire.
Well, in this case, it was way worse because what investigators would later come to realize was that the smoke was toxic. It was straight up toxic in this case because the materials that had been used in this building, so many of them were these synthetic things
Yeah.
that had toxicity to them. Their carpets, the drapes, the seat cushions,
Asbestos kind of
wall
thing.
coverings.
Yeah.
That I didn't see the word asbestos, but they said they were highly flammable and they emitted toxic fumes. Now, the other thing is the lights start flashing and they will ultimately go out.
So you're in the dark trying to get through this black, thick smoke that's toxic.
And
it's nighttime.
Yes. And at this point now, absolute panic.
Oh, yeah.
Absolute panic has overtaken everyone because I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine. The other thing on top of all that we've described is because it's so crowded and there are so many obstructions in the way, people's paths are literally blocked. And there are only a few exits. People they don't remember where they are. They can't see them and they can't get to them. And in some cases, now this was something that I saw time and time again. Several people said some of the exits were locked, but then another source was like, no, none of the exits were locked, but so many of them became blocked. They became blocked. In a 1977 article, the deputy coroner, Morris Garrett, was describing the panic that was going on inside the club, and he told the Associated Press that many of the people who would later be found dead were in areas of the building where they had headed for what they thought were exits. And the governor, who was on the scene by 2 a.m. that night, he added in a quote after this tragedy, "It appeared that supper club attendants led a large group to a curtained wall, thinking that it was an exit or a window, and instead they were trapped." So you had people trampling, you had people who couldn't get where they were going because they were blocked, you had people who were being led to the wrong spot, and in each case, those split seconds could change everything for them, whether they were going to make it out or whether they were going to be trapped inside. So oh my goodness, it got so much more emotional as you're like reading about this, because tragically what happened was the exits that were available, many of them became blocked by people's bodies. Bruce Rath, who was a Fort Thomas firefighter during this event, he was there, trying to save people. He was quoted as saying, "When I got to the inside doors, which is about 30 feet inside the building, I saw these big double doors and people were stacked like cordwood. They were clear up to the top. They just kept diving out on each other, trying to get out. I looked back over the pile and it wasn't dead people. There were dead and alive in that pile. And I went in and just started to grab them 2 at the time and pull them off the stack and drag them out." But the problem was that in so many cases, what had happened was they had to tell some of the firefighters, okay, you keep trying to douse the flames. You guys go try to help people get out, because they quickly realized
they're stuck.
So many of them, like, they could not unstick these doors. Like, they could not get them to clear. And then the fire moved so fast that at some point they had to tell the firefighters and the rescuers, you have to get out, because it was just
too much.
Yes, it was being consumed. Jeff Ruby, again, another quote from him. He and his friends did make it out that night, but he said, quote, "Bodies just trampled in front of that door that swung in." This was a door he was looking at. "And those people just died there. Only a few people got out after we did," talking about the door that he himself managed to escape.
Gosh.
And then talking again about how fast it was, a journalist who ended up writing a book about this, we'll come back to him later, he reflected on this and said, "Split seconds meant life and death. We could be sitting at the same table and I made it out and you didn't, just because you were sitting on the wrong side of the table."
Yeah. And it took you a little bit longer to get to the door.
Yeah, absolutely. Walter, that busboy who made the announcement, obviously made it. He shared how he got out and what he saw. Here's his quote. "So I get pushed out of this exit." And that's the other thing too. Like, it was so many times the mob and the panic, like you would get caught in this crowd and you might get shoved at a door. And if that door didn't open, there's a possibility you might get crushed.
Yeah.
But in his case, he got pushed out of the exit. I'll go back into his quote. "And I go out into the garden area and I'm watching the building, and right then an explosion occurs where the zebra room is, and then another explosion. And the garden rooms, which were inside but with glass walls, started to fill up with smoke. A whole room filled up with smoke in less than a minute, maybe 30 or 40 seconds. People started throwing chairs through the glass and were running out." Wow. So this is the kind of
bedlam. It's just pandemonium and bedlam.
I heard terms like war zone.
Yeah.
I heard one man say, I think this was a rescuer who was trying to help. He said, "You can't imagine what people will do in situations like this." It honestly is heartbreaking.
It's sort of reminding me right now of almost like the Titanic.
Yes.
Where it's just, you may get on a lifeboat or you may not.
Yeah. But in this case, so much faster. And
Yes.
fire coming at you. And
Yes.
I mean, and this black smoke, it's just horrific. And then to think you might not be able to see at the same time that all this is happening.
It also reminds me of the Carrollton bus crash.
Yes, at 100%. Yeah. By the way, I've said this, but I'll just blatantly put it out there. Some of the actual news reports or news footage from 1977 obviously gave some really powerful information. And they had a lot of detail. I did find this one really detailed 1977 article. I've now referenced it 2 or 3 times. It's in my show notes, but I'm going back to that again. They had an eyewitness account from a man named Matt Valentine who was working in the parking area. So therefore he was
outside the building.
But he was seeing things. He was standing by the main entrance when the fire broke out, and he said, at first it didn't look too bad. There was a little smoke and a few people were coming out, and then there was a big rush with people jumping over others to get out as smoke billowed. And then he went on to say, and then suddenly the whole club was engulfed. It was just so fast. And coming back to this point about the smoke, there's this very short clip I'm going to play for you, which I think kind of drives home how they didn't just have the panic and the fire. The smoke alone was this whole other entity. So this is just a few seconds, but I'll let you hear this.
More than 200 were hurt and 165 people dead.
They had no chance, most of them. It went through there so fast, and the cloud of toxic smoke from all of the synthetic substances that were in the building materials was absolutely poisoning. It was so toxic, people would walk out of that building and look perfectly fine, just like you and I, and fall dead within seconds because their lungs were just totally shot.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's a whole other deadly threat beyond the fire was just breathing in that smoke.
Oh my gosh. So that guy said they would get out of the building and look fine and just drop dead
because
in seconds.
That toxic smoke was in their lungs. I couldn't even when I heard that. Unbelievable. Guys, it was one just heart-rending story after another. Just to kind of give you a few examples, according to that same 1977 article, they said they recovered some of the bodies from inside the cabaret room, the people who had not gotten out, still seated in circles because apparently they were overcome by the smoke before they were even able to just even try to get out.
So they were just at their dinner table slumped over?
They were still seated, yes, at their table. Oh. Yeah. There were so many stories where people were heroic. For example, there was a man named Harold Russell Penwell who managed to push his wife Karen to safety, but then he didn't get out. He was only 28 years old, the father of 2 and the winner of the Bronze Star in Vietnam. There was a lady named Etta Lees who was 70 years old who died while she was trying to help a handicapped woman get out. Of course, the firefighters were very heroic. 5 of them were among the 200 who were injured that night. On that night, they had 50 fire departments and more than 550 firefighters who ended up at that scene.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I pulled a quote from this chief who was talking, he was reflecting on this experience. Here's what he said. I think I can speak for the firefighters who were there when I say that May 28th, 1977 was the worst day of our firefighting career, but I believe it was also our finest hour. Every firefighter who was there either risked their life or was willing to risk their life to try and save those trapped. Over 2,000 patrons got out alive. And we'll come back to that too. That's
a large number.
That's the blessing that they did. 2,000 people did make it. To finish his quote, even when it was clear that no one left in the building could be saved, firefighters went back into the building over and over to try and remove the bodies of those who perished. To this day, that haunts all of us who were there. It always will.
Wow.
The roof of the building collapsed around midnight. The fire was finally brought under control around 2 a.m. the next morning, but it continued to smolder until May 30th.
Whoa.
Kentucky Governor Julian Carroll arrived at the scene around 2 a.m., as I've already said, and he made it clear that he was going to have a hand in directing the investigation. Now, just to make this clear, we've alluded to it. Ultimately, 200 people were injured and 165 died as a result of this fire and the smoke.
So 200 were injured plus another
165 who died.
Died, okay.
Yes. Now, some of those people didn't die until months later. later
Oh.
because they just kept trying to save them and ultimately couldn't. But yes, the final count was 165 people who died. And most of the people who died were in the cabaret room. Even to this day, this tragedy is the third deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history.
Wow.
It is the Cincinnati area's deadliest fire. And I looked it up just because I wondered. It would come up when I would just Google, I didn't do a deep dive, but I just Googled deadliest nightclub fires in the world. This would come up on lists of like 10 to 15. It would make it.
Wow.
Yeah. So many people lost whole groups. There was one woman, for example, her name was Dana Stallings. She tried to escape the building with her family, and she shared that it felt like the fire was chasing them and how hard it was. They couldn't see because the lights had gone out. And she remembered having to like shove and push to get through this door, but the rest of her family didn't make it.
Oh, no.
So she was only 21 at the time. She lost her mother, 2 sisters, sister-in-law, her aunt, and her great-aunt. In one fell swoop, going there just to see, and a performer. There was a group, the Edgewood City School District. They lost 13 members, 13 employees who had gone to celebrate the retirement of one of their teachers. There was a group of 82 people who went with the Dayton Automobile Club, and 31 of them did not make it. People just lost like these whole groups of loved ones or friends or family in one
I saw a photo,
event.
one of the pictures, I don't know if you have his story, but one of the photos was a man who I think had lost several of his, he wasn't there that night, but I think he came
his
and
picture,
he had
too.
lost his mom and sisters and he
yes.
was just bereft.
Yeah, I saw his picture. I didn't include his story, but I saw it and it just breaks your heart. Well, John Davidson survived. He shared his story. He has not wanted to talk about this.
I bet.
This has been a traumatic, obviously, experience for him, but a few different times over the years, he would share just a little bit. He was backstage when smoke began to fill the building. He got outside. In fact, he said, quote, "I was one of the lucky ones, got out through a door that was put in the year before. It was a backdoor entrance to the dressing room. He said, I decided we'll see how long we have to stay outside. They'll put out the fire and we'll come back in and do the show. But in the 1977 article, it's not the same one, it's a different one, he told the Associated Press how as he was going out through the door, that at first they were just kind of slowly filing out, and then the filing got faster and faster. And he said, quote, just seconds after we got out, the door we came through was engulfed with smoke and flames. Now, he was actually seen, several people reported this, as he went out that door, he held the door open so that others could get out too. And one last quote from him, the people were jamming the doors and there was such a panic. I estimate there was 1,000 people in the one room I was in just jammed in. So as he was trying to, like as they were trying to get out that door.
Yeah.
And he lost his musical director. That was one of the people who was lost in the fire. Just to kind of briefly go back to that idea of some of the other heroes, we've talked about the firefighters, but there were some other heroes too, people from the community who came together to help out afterwards. One man was one of these workers in the building. His name was Wayne Dammert. He was in his early 40s, and he talked about this evening, which was very traumatic for him. He said, quote, I saw bodies lying all over the place. Unbelievable. I bet I saw 100 or more. In the garden area, that beautiful garden area, bodies were lying everywhere. I asked one waitress, are you religious? And I don't even remember what she said, but I said, if you can pray, you pray for the people in this area and I'll do it in this other area. And I'd put my hand on their forehead and say, God, please take this soul to heaven. I did that for maybe 50 bodies. And he talked about how he tried to do what he could to kind of comfort people that night. The National Guard, they came in to help. So they had National Guard Army trucks who took the bodies from the Supper Club to the place where they had to set up their kind of makeshift morgue. It was only a mile away, and they used the Fort Thomas, Kentucky Armory, which actually, it was like set up in basketball courts. So they end up laying all these people who had passed away on a floor. It looks like a basketball court. It looks like a gym floor, and they're just kind of stacked in rows. Teenagers volunteered.
I saw that photo. They volunteered. I was like,
They would carry the bodies from the trucks on stretchers into the armory where
that's
they would be
so much
laid
for
out.
a teenager.
Well, I saw an interview where one of those boys, decades later, he was a middle-aged man reflecting back, and he said, I volunteered. He was only 13 at the time. He said, I didn't realize how that was going to affect me. Yeah. Of course, they were being as respectful as they could be. They had, sheets, and they were covering the bodies, trying to give as much dignity as possible. But the identification process was just awful to begin with. But it was even harder because so many of the people had come from far away, and women in the panic, they'd left purses behind.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And then you had people who were just burned beyond recognition. So there were just so many factors. And this man who was reflecting on the experience said the nurses were the backbone of the operation within the armory. He talked about how incredibly kind they were, that they would just kind of their own initiative, they would take washcloths and they would, kind of wipe smudges off the faces of the people who'd passed, sometimes try to smooth down their hair, just doing what they could to make them look presentable, knowing that their loved ones were going to have to identify them. And it was primarily the nurses who had to take those people down, and they would have to just kind of go down the row. And when they felt like, they knew they had the females in one row and males in another, and they would have to kind of one at a time pull back.
And just think, if you're looking at your family, but you're having to see everybody else's family too until you get to your family.
And yes, but this person who was talking about it, he said he commented on how awful the process was altogether, but then when they would get to their loved one, and he said, and then you'd just see them like collapse. Yeah. And then, of course, it'd be these nurses who would have to try to comfort them. Just absolutely horrific. Well, moving on to the investigation and the aftermath. So after an investigative team reviewed the evidence, a Campbell County grand jury ultimately ruled that the fire was not set intentionally. They decided it was faulty aluminum wiring. That was the culprit. Now, this went through, there was, the little to do. I think there was actually a place where they made one ruling and then they came back and ruled something different. But this is the ultimate determination. And this led to a nationwide movement to improve fire codes, which I remember that's something Brian commented on, wasn't it?
Yes, he had said that I think you can find it in fire safety. This is the reason why we have these things.
Yeah. Well, it was determined that the owners built additions to the building, and as they were renovating it and building on additions, they did not adhere to the fire codes that were in place at that time. In fact, I actually saw where Julian Carroll, the governor, had said something about they didn't really have a clause at that time. If a new building was built, you had to meet these fire codes. But what about if
adding on things?
Right, or if it was an older building, did you have to go back and did you have to put those in after the fact?
Yeah.
So that was a little gray area back then. But a 1977 Kentucky State investigative report found that there were 10 factors that contributed to the, quote, loss of life or injury. I'm not reading all 10, but I'm going to read a few of them. They said, absolutely, the overcrowding in the cabaret room.
Yeah.
The fact that tables and chairs jammed the aisles and the ramps, which blocked pathways. There was no employee training in evacuation and emergency procedures. They had all of these flammable components, like wood framing, lack of fire separation devices, so that, if a fire started, nothing, it was just going to go. There was nothing to kind of a firewall or a
firewall,
block, right?
Okay.
And all of the things, especially, quote, the decorative paneling and a lot of these things in the interior finish contributed to the spread of the fire.
I would think even those oil paintings you were talking about.
And no audible alarm, no sprinkler systems. Yeah. As we've just said, this led to drastic changes. An associate professor at Northern Kentucky University, Dr. Brian Hackett, who actually he was involved with an exhibit on the fire back in 2014. He had this quote, "It changed mostly the fire laws. Now you have to have sprinklers. You have to have battery operated lights so that people can get out. You can't use certain materials to build things out of." And he goes on to say, you go to any restaurant in town and you're going to see a sign posted somewhere near the door that tells you how many people can safely be in that building.
You do.
That is because of the Beverly Hills Supper Club.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was just giving some examples because obviously they affected more than those. But as Brian said, forever we have some new safety measures in place because of this. Now, obviously, as you would expect, there were lots of lawsuits. I saw one source that said survivors filed more than $1.8 billion worth of lawsuits. Now, that's how much was filed.
Yeah.
I did not do a deep dive. I just saw a few things, so I don't know if this is the definitive information or data, but that this was something that was groundbreaking. So many lawsuits were filed. A district judge in late 1977 ruled that all the lawsuits filed in federal court would be tried as a class action lawsuit.
So kind of lumping them all together?
Yes. Okay. And this was the first class action mass tort lawsuit in U.S. history.
Oh, wow.
They collectively, the families of the victims collectively received $30 million in that class action suit. Now, somehow more money was given because I saw a different article, a 2020 article published in the Dayton Daily News that said, quote, in all, victims and their families won about $43 million in settlements.
Who paid? From who?
Oh, I'm sure the company, the
Supper Club, the people that owned it?
Yes,
okay. Did they have that much money to give out?
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah. And they had insurance too, I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay.
It went on to say previous settlements involved lawsuits against the club owners, insurance companies, a utility company accused of failing to inspect wiring, and makers of polyvinyl chloride and other products and materials used in the club. So that actually answered your question.
Okay.
I should have just finished the sentence.
I should have let you. There we go.
That seems like the end of the story, doesn't it, Ashley?
It does.
Guess what?
What?
I was taken by surprise
What?
because I saved this for the end because I thought you would appreciate this.
Yeah.
When I started to research this, the first thing I saw were articles from a month ago or 2 months ago because just this past May, they dedicated a memorial.
Oh.
It took me so by surprise. I'm like, why are there so many articles from the last 2 months? So what happened was on the anniversary of the 1977 fire this past May, the Beverly Hills Memorial was dedicated along US 27 at Memorial Point Drive with about 300 people who came. The ceremony, of course, was, I'm sure very reverent and beautiful. I know they said specifically that there were some moments of silence, that there were some prayers, and that they used bagpipes at some point.
That'd have been beautiful.
The memorial itself features the names of those people who lost their lives. It includes a list of local first responder units that responded to the fire. It has a list of the federal and state fire safety regulations that were implemented because of the fire. They have recollections of a firefighter, and they have some photos of the Beverly Hills Supper Club. And this was something that had to be worked out, who's going to maintain it. So the memorial site will become a park maintained by the city of Southgate. Now, what is interesting is I found out that not long after the fire, for years and decades, family members, friends, people, who survived it have pushed for some type of memorial. And then when they just said at some point down the road, we think we're going to do this, there was actually some pushback from, yes. So what happened?
From who?
Okay, here's what happened. This memorial is actually part of a development, okay? It's actually about 80 acres, and it's going to be, some of it's I'm sure already under construction right now, but I don't think it's finished. But it's 80 acres that's going to consist of an assisted living center, apartments, some homes, and it had 2 planned memorials, and this was all announced back in 2020. But this group of victims' families who banded together and called themselves Respect the Dead, that's their organization, they were very concerned because it looked as though the plans were actually going to place things on the site where the cabaret room was, and that's where most of the people had died.
And I don't know if you've mentioned this yet or not, but when it burned down there, they did not rebuild. It is just an overgrown field at this point
with some pictures, hanging that's that kind of show what was in this location. Yes. Well, Respect the Dead, together with some other survivors and first responders and people who felt the same way, they actually filed a suit later that same year, within a few months. So it was September of 2020, to try to stop the development from going forward. Obviously, some people just felt like it was disrespectful. They just didn't want anything on that site at all. Other people believe that their loved ones' remains may still be in that area, and they didn't want that happening.
Yeah.
So what ultimately happened was later in 2020, I believe it was December, they reached a settlement with the developers, and those developers agreed they were going to include a deed that would restrict construction on the cabaret room site.
Good.
So that's, I think the plan now is the survivors and the families are going to maybe try to put a fountain or something
Oh, that'd be
there
nice.
something they choose and they want to design. And
I like that.
yeah. A man who was present that night working as a busboy said, "To me, this memorial represents closure. It is important to have a place where the families and friends of those who died can go to remember those they lost. It is important for our community to make sure we never forget." And then I ran across one last thing.
Oh, no.
That I want to share with you. There was a May 2021 WHAS 11 news segment that was called Unsolved. And this totally, again, took me by surprise, but I thought before we end, I would just share this because this is kind of a side note to the story. We've kind of brought it to full closure, except for this that's kind of ongoing over here to the side.
An electrical fire is not, what they're saying, aluminum wiring. That's all a lie. Completely a lie.
State officials ruled the fire accidental early on, but former employees didn't buy it.
We are positive, without a doubt, that it was arson.
They spent decades pushing for answers.
This is the room where it started.
Begging for an investigation.
And that's where the guys were working during the day.
They say they were met with pushback and excuses. So they started their own quest for answers.
But we know exactly what happened.
And then a former journalist put all of the pieces in one place.
Hi, I'm Peter Bronson. I'm the author of Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld, and the Supper Club Inferno. I set out to find out what happened in the 1977 Supper Club fire, which is the greatest tragedy in regional history. And it led me down a path to the mob.
The teenage busboy remembered seeing workers in the room where the fire started earlier that day. He says he asked the property owners about it weeks later.
I said they were working in the ceiling for over 2 hours that I saw. And he goes, well, we had no contracted work that day. And he goes, what did they say they were working on? I said, the air conditioning system. He goes, they lied to you. He goes, there was no AC in that room at all.
It was the first sign that something wasn't right, but not the last.
You look at the history of Northern Kentucky in this era. You can go back through the 70s, and every year, a major nightclub, casino, strip joint, restaurant is burned down by arson, by the mob. And then all of a sudden, here we go, 70, 71, 72, all the way up to 77. And what do you know? There's the Beverly Hills Supper Club, the biggest, most spectacular of all.
Wow. So interesting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me want to know more because
yes, I want to talk to that journalist guy.
Well, he has a book.
I want to read his book.
I looked it up. Now, I found it on Goodreads and Amazon. It did not have a lot of reviews.
Okay.
Not many people have read it.
When did he put it out?
I didn't look that up.
Okay.
But the people who read it gave it pretty good reviews. It's like around the 4-star mark. I know you like a good conspiracy theory.
That was right up my alley. I was like, yes.
And obviously, we know so little about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder how much, like
it's compelling.
It makes you wonder how many people, was there anybody else who saw those men working that day, or was it just one person? I would love to know more. Is there corroboration to that? What kind of detail work went into the investigation that came up with this faulty wiring determination? I would love to know. I would love to know more.
I would too. I'm going to get that book.
Oh, by the way, in case you're looking for it, it was called Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld, and the Supper Club Inferno by Peter Bronson.
All right, Peter, I'm going to read your book.
Armchair Psychologist.
Well, that brings us to our armchair.
Gosh, what can you say?
I tried to think of a great armchair question. It's just the most heartbreaking story ever. I couldn't even think of one. So it actually brought me back to something that you often will ask at the end of one of our episodes. What lessons can be learned from this?
Right. What lessons can you learn from this? Listen, trust your gut. That wonderful busboy that got up there. If putting myself in there, and of course we can't victim blame. We cannot say it's your own fault that you didn't leave. But getting up there, if someone says to you, there is a fire, you need to exit, believe them, go ahead and leave. What is it going to hurt? Okay, maybe it's a hoax, but at least you're now alive, and it's also heartbreaking to me that in our human history, multiple people have to die before anything will change. How many stories have we covered? Rebecca Schaefer, things that happen. Somebody had to die and enough people have to die before we'll actually enact change. Why can't we do it before then? Because it has to affect the person. It has to be enough that it affects people.
Well, I don't think you're wrong, but on a slightly more, I guess, optimistic look, or maybe a more forgiving, maybe that's the way, maybe this is a more forgiving perspective. I think sometimes people just have no idea that that's going to happen. You live in your little world where you're like,
it's
this
a
is going
bubble.
to be fine. I've done everything right. I think I've followed the rules, or this isn't going to happen. And then
it does.
And when something horrific or tragic happens, all of a sudden, boy, do you learn from that.
Right. I guess just be aware of your surroundings. Look around. Be aware of everything. Where are the exits? If something happens, how will I get out of here? Have a plan. Because like you said, there were split-second decisions. That was a matter of life and death. And even those that made it out, they still died because of the smoke.
You know, I think that is a good point. I think it's sad in our world today how often, maybe unexpectedly, you do end up in situations where you're in danger and you did not anticipate that could happen. And sometimes it could be something like just being out in society and something happens. But even other situations, normal situations, being on a plane.
Right.
You know, you're just flying a plane.
Right.
I think there is something to be said for looking around you, being aware of your surroundings. What would be a good exit plan? What would I do if? And not making yourself anxious, not getting obsessed about it, but just kind of thinking through, what are my options? What could I do to make sure that I stay safe?
Brian laughs at me, but every time we go over a bridge, I'm always running through in my head, okay, if the bridge collapses, do I take the seatbelt off before we hit the water? Or when we hit the water, what do I do? Do I roll the window down now? Or when do I do these things? And like I always say, what's our action plan if something happens? Just always be aware of what are you going to do when something happens. And now I have a little seatbelt cutter and a breaker, and I'll get that out of the glove box and hold it until we get over the bridge.
It goes back to, we've talked about fire, families, you know, having your simple plan of what would happen if a fire broke out in this house. Where would you go? Where would you exit? How would we know that all 4 of us or 5 of us or however many are safe?
What are we going to try to take out of the house? What are we leaving behind?
Yeah. And having that conversation of don't take anything, get out, you know, I mean, just absolutely some of those things, just simple conversations or simple awareness or simple plans could really matter, I guess, in moments when your tendency would be just to absolutely panic. Well, that was a really sad story, but I do think there's something to be said for understanding what happens in our history, tragic or not.
My cousin Lauren had a really great quote. She was talking about movies, but I think you could apply it to this. She said there are good movies and then there are important movies. So this is not a good story, but it's an important story because you need to know that this happened so that you can learn from history and so that hopefully it will never, ever, ever happen again. Absolutely. So I think it's an important story and that we need to tell it even if it is hard.
And also to preserve the memory of these people.
To honor those people.
Yes, to honor the people we lost and to honor the people who stepped up.
And risked their lives.
Absolutely. Or took on very traumatic tasks to try to serve others. So who are we going to cheers, Ashley?
I would like to cheers that very first busboy that stepped on stage and in a calm voice told people, here's what's happening, here's where the exits are, and here's how you can get out of here. Walter. The 18-year-old busboy, the first hero of the night. I think we need to cheers him because he probably, like you said in the story, saved a lot of lives.
All right. Cheers to you, Walter.
Cheers.
If you love what we do, please rate and review our show. Or you can become a supporter by making a donation through buymeacoffee.com/scandalwaterpod. Whether a single gift or a recurring monthly donation, it would go a long way towards supporting our work and allowing us to keep the tea brewing.
At our website, www.scandalwaterpodcast.com, you can submit questions or your own story ideas, access our sources and show notes, see the merch we offer for sale, and more. You can join the Scandal Water community through our Scandal Water Podcast Facebook page or follow us on Instagram or TikTok at Scandal Water Podcast.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown,
that's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music. Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.